Good afternoon. You're watching AB Live, a brand new news-based chat show in which we discuss topics ranging from news, technology, and so much more. On today's episode, we will be discussing blockchain, a term that all of us have heard, most of us have used, and not a lot of us actually know what it means. So today in the studio, we have Rajeev Lalwani, who is essentially going to educate us about blockchain technology. Thank you so much for joining us, Rajeev.
Good morning to all your audience. Thank you for inviting me as well.
Our pleasure, absolutely. So let's just get straight into it. What exactly is blockchain technology in detail? We know it as a decentralized public ledger essentially, but what would an expert say it is?
So look, there are different perspectives on blockchain, and I'll put some perspective of mine. And there's enough material out there to look at blockchain. In many ways, a good way to look at blockchain is that it automates trust.
Okay.
In our personal and business and commercial lives, we become so dependent on one commodity called trust, right? So when we hail a taxi, we trust that the individual is going to come on time. When you expected me here, you laid a certain amount of trust in Deloitte and the value chain. What blockchain tries to do is to literally develop a mechanism to automate that trust using a combination of cryptography, which has been around now.
Yeah.
The whole of the internet relies on cryptography, right? It also relies on, what it does is it decentralizes the mechanism of creating trust. Now, we've seen examples of decentralization of trust in tourism, for example. You go somewhere in TripAdvisor, you put your comments out there.
Yeah.
That allows you to then trust. If there are good positive comments, you probably tend to take that hotel, for example. What blockchain does is, in a similar way, it creates a community and a community-based trust environment using cryptography.
Right.
The other feature it does is it sort of removes the man in the middle, if you like, the proverbial central authority. And that allows us to communicate using some of the same infrastructure that we've created. So, internet has created an infrastructure for exchange of information.
Right.
Through emails. But what it does is goes one step further, uses some of the same infrastructure to create an exchange of value.
Okay.
So now you can start to store value, and value is not
monetary
dollars,
value.
not always dollars or money in a classical sense. The value could be a digital certificate. For example, if you passed out from a university and someone wanted to check whether that's authentic or not, you could put that using some of the same values aside. It's network, so you could distribute it. It's public, so a community could see it. Right. When I again say public, it doesn't always mean public at large. You could create a secured set of communities which could look at it.
Right.
It's secured because it uses some of the same cryptology which we use massively to exchange information.
Right. So
I'll kind of pause there, but that sort of kind of gives you a primer in terms of what my perspective is on blockchain.
All right, it was quite detailed, of course, but then you've used the term cryptography a few times, and I know that most people confuse cryptocurrencies with blockchain, but essentially if you had to differentiate between the two, how would you do that?
Yeah. So Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies are just an example use case of a larger technology. And sometimes it's, we could depart from saying blockchain all the time and use distributed ledger technology, and DLT is a better sort of moniker of this new infrastructure that is getting created. Because the moment you say blockchain, it just gets almost synonymized with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is only a specific use case for creating a currency or a digital currency in a certain kind of format. Again, we can have another session on that.
Yeah, but what would the other use cases be? Sorry.
That's a great question. Yeah. So the DLT or blockchain technology has extraordinary number of use cases. I mean, you can think wherever there is, I think 2-3 things you can combine together, right? So wherever there is trust needed, right? So let's talk about region, for example. There is trust needed in the Islamic world on the halal food, for example. Now that's a great opportunity. I have not really researched whether it just came to my mind right now. How about creating a ledger technology which allows public to see whether a food item is halal or not, for example.
Okay.
Now, that can be a use case, for example.
Right.
The other is where you need identity, people and the value to be identified. I gave an example of Ministry of Education or universities using blockchain to say Shruti passed out from this university, and this is an authentic identification of her, as well as the grades and certificate that she passed out, which could be given out to a close group of people on check-in, check-out basis, or to a kind of more public itself.
Right.
Real estate, land transfers. You would realize that the trade in land and property can significantly be impacted if the information about that property is not available. We tend to rely then on a word of mouth and things like that, right? So if that were available publicly in terms of how the property is exchanged hands in an immutable public ledger, that's another great use case, for example.
But who has control over this, about who's going to see it, if it's on the public domain?
Okay, that's another large topic. So you can, theoretically, you could create a completely public ledger, right?
Okay.
Where no single authority really has a control. It's the community of users who have a control.
Okay.
You could then move towards another extreme, which could be a completely private community. So, we people sitting here, we could decide to create a community of blockchain sort of ledger, if you like, a distributed ledger. And we could say we are going to act as nodes. You will find this being used as a sort of definition of the users or computer, which are networked. Okay. And we could decide and set some rules.
So we're like administrators then?
Then we all become, and we could define some rules on how the values and the record keeping happens on this community. Okay. So it's now it's a community ledger rather than a public ledger, right?
Right, understood. Now just bringing the topic back to Dubai. So now we've had some really ambitious goals, and it was announced that Dubai aims to be a completely blockchain powered government by 2020. So what exactly would this mean for the country's economy, for Dubai's economy?
So I would probably, step back. I think Dubai has always been in the forefront of using disruptive technologies, right? But let me just step back into more government, right, use cases and what governments are doing in the context of the region. I think one good news is that and we do a lot of work as Deloitte in public sector, right? One interesting thing you see from a Western world, the Western governments have a legacy of automation spanning from 10, 20, 30, or even 40, 50 years. And that legacy of data and the rules and infrastructure they've created, it's extremely difficult to transform. That problem we don't have in the region, and particularly in the context of Dubai, it becomes much more easily to cause change and transformation. Okay. And I think that is the one distinguishing feature, certainly I would say, for Dubai, right. That it takes kind of it remains on the forefront in use of not just blockchain. I mean, you have the AI minister now, right? Right. So in using disruptive technologies. Now the impact, I think if I have to take just one point, blockchain reduces cost of governance because it tends to decentralize. You don't need massive arrays of people checking in and checking out. Okay. So for example, most countries I know in the Middle East are trying to improve competitiveness, and one key factor of competitiveness is how quickly you can create a business. So let's say, Shruti, you wanted to create Shruti Inc. Here, how much time does it take you to create a business? The reality is that the government needs to check you out in terms of the investor KYC, your background checks, your premises where you're going to set up your business, the economic model, the labor clearances, and so on and so forth. Now that's a great use case, and many of the countries are working on that. And if you just have to do a single check-in and single check-out, imagine the compression we can cause in the time we can create a business, for example. So I know certain governments are working in that direction, using blockchain technologies. Overall, I think my view is that it should reduce the transaction costs.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. So that was quite detailed. But now talking about cost efficiency, etc. But how much actually is being invested by the government, by the Dubai government, in terms of this entire blockchain strategy that they have?
So I would not be able to give specific numbers, but it's suffice to say it's a kind of fairly serious amount of effort that's going in, and it's not always a dollar, right? It's the amount of direction, the vision that's being laid out. I also feel that there will be a degree of, if you have 100 use cases, there will be some which will fly extremely well, and there will be others which would need to be tested in terms of the adoption.
Right.
Because one of the biggest challenges that I've found in the projects that I have led and we've done, the biggest challenge is around the you create an infrastructure, you create an idea. How do you make sure that it gets adopted?
And is that a problem? Sorry, I have to ask you this right now. So adoption, have you seen that as a problem in the region? And I'm not talking with regards to the government. I'm talking with regards to the organizations in terms of implementing.
So when I said adoption, it does mean kind of more broader. So I kind of departed from the government or localized conversation. I think what we are seeing is, and earlier on we were talking about where is blockchain in terms of the investment and hype. I think blockchain has gone through, if you're familiar with the Gartner's kind of hype cycle, then blockchain has gone through this hype cycle, and we are in that, going through a trough of kind of disillusionment, and then moving towards a plateau of productivity. My view is, and if you track some of the investments, the investors investing in blockchains, the new startups that are coming in, and sometimes just the sheer number of size of the conferences, particularly in the US, tends to be in the forefront of a lot of these conferences. The size is becoming smaller. However, that is not necessarily a bad news.
Why?
Because what you have now is more serious players. So I know some of the large organizations, without specifically naming, are setting up infrastructure where you can, if you're familiar with platform as a service, so how do we create blockchain as a service where the community can come and create use cases.
Right.
And those investments I'm seeing started to come on. And a lot of these infrastructure companies, I think one good indicator would be when some of these large organizations starts kind of vesting into, for example, IBM's or AWS or Microsoft. Some of these large players start kind of creating infrastructures for building some of the use cases for the businesses.
But is it only the large organizations that actually matter? Because right now what we've seen in Dubai and in the UAE as a whole is that a lot of startups are coming out and setting up blockchain businesses, services, facilities, etc.
So when I said the large players entering in, and I'm seeing them enter, does not mean that the small players don't matter. I think the nimbleness of startups and startup ecosystem far exceeds what some of the large players can do. But what happens is the way large players operate is that they do test of the ROI and the resilience of that idea before investing and embarking on large projects. However, some of the new ideas, I also equally believe that some of the existing infrastructure, and I don't mean the roads and other, but the economic infrastructure is so vested in large legacy players that sometimes it needs a disruptor coming in. And you've seen in the tourism industries and rideshare industries, right? Airbnb and Uber's coming in and disrupting the existing structure. So I won't be surprised that in some of the use cases in different industries, whether healthcare or telcos or government or banking, there will be some disruptors coming in.
Right. Then speaking of, which would you say are the main sectors that are going to be benefiting from blockchain then?
So certainly government, I think overall governments are trying to and I'm going to say something. So the governments are trying to minimize government and sort of maximize what we call the governance, right?
Okay.
And transparency and trust, right?
So no bureaucracy?
So your reduction of that. So government is a great sort of place to start, but it becomes very uncomfortable because by very nature, blockchain questions the central authority.
Right.
And governments are built on centralization
Correct,
to some extent of the authority. So you have to let go to be able to create more governance, right? So that's a great idea to work on, and I think that would happen in due course.
But does this not just go against the whole decentralization scheme? When the government takes control over blockchain, where is the whole decentralization element coming into it then?
So in the first kind of portion, I mentioned that there are different kind of use cases, and those will mandate how centralized you keep the use case, right? So in the case of national security, I'm sure you would want to centralize that, right? And who enters your airports and border controls. However, on the other hand, the other use case I spoke about was certificates. That could be a community where you may decentralize to a community of employers, education institutions, and the students, right? Where the student willingly opts in to say, okay, I'm willing to put this on blockchain, for example. And there could be completely public peer-to-peer sort of environments where you could have a very minimal kind of central authority. That could be peer-to-peer exchanges of value, remittances, for example. Larger banks and communities coming together in trade finance, for example. So trade finance is a great sort of area to work on. Settlement and clearances, the amount of effort and money that goes in reconciliations is very, very serious in these areas.
How about real estate then? Like in terms of how the real estate market is right now, do you not think it could be like an open ledger system for the real estate market could do a lot of good for the industry as a whole?
So some of the smaller economies that I'm aware of have experimented with blockchain. I'm not particularly familiar with this space in terms of the region on what they are doing, but there is a clear use case in land transfers, for example. Now, again, you got to look at I think the regulation. So one area we didn't sort of cover is the regulation in each of the areas, and where you take the banking sector is highly regulated, and for right reasons.
Right.
Real estate as well, for investor protections and small investor protections, has a degree of regulation. I think what the regulators need to do equally as technologists, we as technologists kind of drive to blockchain, is that you need to create what is known as the anticipatory regulation. You need to anticipate what regulation is needed, and I think that needs to go hand in hand. So the speed with which you can anticipate what regulations would be needed to manage a community rather than a centralized management. Once some of these structures come in, you would see, and certainly your real estate is a good use case.
And when do you see that coming in then?
Where or when?
When? On a mass scale?
It's kind of a difficult question. I wish I had a crystal ball, then we'll all be billionaires. I think give it about 3 years. I said that typically the hype cycle, you're in you're bottoming it out, and you're kind of moving to the the plateau of what they call as productivity. So I would say the typical sort of hype cycles takes 2 to 3 years from moving from disillusionment to productivity. So give it 3 to 4 years, and you would see some real use cases. But the beauty would be that you would actually still do some of the same things, but you would not recognize that it is actually sitting on blockchain, because the best technology is one that is hidden, and it helps you and me. Right,
and this is the era of emerging technologies, so you never know what's going to be invented in the future. But now, again, speaking of, you essentially explained the trough and the hype and the trough. So what else would you say are the main challenges that the whole blockchain technology and the blockchain ecosystem is facing right now?
So there are a few from the projects that my teams have done, and we have a big center across several centers across the world in Deloitte. We call them Garage.
Okay.
Where we build blockchain solutions for our clients and for communities. I think if I have to single out one area where people and all of us kind of need to work if we want this technology, to use this technology and be successful, is the adoption. And I think adoption in a traditional sense means that you create a software and then you adopt it. But when I say adoption, it's creation of an ecosystem, definition of the regulatory environment, because that needs to change, clear articulation of the operating model through which the ecosystem will work, and then the most important one, the adoption, I mean, is the liquidity. And when I say liquidity, it means the ability to have enough buyers and sellers, or enough takers and people who want to transact and move the value around. Right? So I think that liquidity is an extremely important thing, and a lot of people miss that out because it gets treated as a technology project.
So Rajeev, would you say scalability is one of the challenges right now in terms of the sheer size of transactions that can actually take place on blockchain?
So yes, it's been a problem in certain use cases which require high transactions per second requirements. Blockchain as a solution we found to be limiting. Distributed ledger technology can be a limiting factor. However, in majority of the cases, one thing that you have to also understand is that the number of companies that are working in solving this problem, we believe that it is likely to get solved in a couple of years. So what you also have to anticipate, particularly when you're working with disruptive technologies, rather than some of the regular technology which exists and been tried and tested, is that you have to anticipate that some of these problems will get solved. And we know from experience and speaking with some of the experts that work with us, that the scalability and the performance problem is being addressed by a number of tech firms.
Understood. And how about security? I know blockchain is essentially sold as a secure distributed ledger system, decentralized, etc. But then how secure is secure? So that brings me to cybersecurity, essentially, hacking and other problems like that. And especially when you're talking about banking and other sectors that blockchain could be implemented in.
Yeah. So look, again, it would be wrong on my part to say that things cannot be given enough time and computing power. We can hack practically anything, right? The thing is, blockchain uses some of the same cryptology which has created our information world in which we live and we trust institutions, right? So when you interact with your bank, for example, through an app or on the web, you are relying on some of the same security protocols, and it is as secure, if not more, than some of the same protocols. There are organizations, and again, we could have another conversation on something called homomorphic security. So there are organizations working on, the very nature of blockchain is that it's a distributed ledger, which means everyone can have a look at, those who have access, or the nodes can have a look at the transactions. But then if you want to secure some of that information and yet be able to compute on top of that information, so there are some technologies working on now which will keep it secret and yet we can compute. So computationally we can work on that secured information, which would be a big leap in my view on the distributed ledger technology.
Right, and so the whole irreversibility element of it, won't that be a problem in terms of hacking?
I would say once you get into quantum computing world, that a lot of the security infrastructure will have to be kind of revisited. Until then, I would be as worried or not worried as you are in transacting with your banks, for example. Right. So you're using security when you use information exchange right now. It is no different.
All right, great. I'm just going to leave you with this last question about the key trends right now in blockchain technology, and what are the predictions for the coming 3 years? You said that we're going to see a mass implementation in about 3 years. I'm not going to quote you on that, but during the 3 years, what are the major transformations that we could ideally see?
I think a lot of industries, so banking, for example, I would say would be the first one that comes to my mind, because the amount and the transaction cost that banks incur every time you do a $100 transaction, for example, the transactions cost can be $3 to $4 dollars or even more. That's a very high cost of financial transactions. I think it's the business that will drive some of this adoption, and I do see adoption sort of increasing in some of these areas. Now, banking, the problem is that banking doesn't operate in isolation. So you take trade finance, some of the ecosystems around ports, for example, traders, who exchange goods and letter of credit and some of these documents. All of this ecosystems need to get onto the blockchain, and these chains will then interact with each other, right? And that is going to take some time. But once it sort of, you will see formation of these ecosystems over several years. And then you'll have a tipping point where you're sitting on a blockchain reducing the transaction cost. So that's the way I look at it. I mean, banking is just one example. You could apply that to healthcare industry, on medical records, for example, and how you and I can feel secure and yet be able to publish our medical records with different doctors and specialists that we move around, for example. Or the trust we repose in, let's say, halal food, for example, in what we consume. So these are just, examples of use cases. I also feel that the blockchain and distributed ledger on its own will get mixed up with other disruptive technologies, whether it's data, AI. So not just a distributed sort of ledger, but combining it with other sort of existing or future technologies is going to happen. The blockchain in its own form, as we understood it, may sort of get changed quite dramatically in the actual use.
Interesting, but whatever the future is, it's super exciting at this juncture at least. But thank you so much for educating us about blockchain. I do feel a little wiser about the whole blockchain technology that is in the market. And thank you for watching ABTV. We will be back again next Tuesday.
Thank you.